A traveling cotton broker from Charleston made a discovery in April 1857 that would follow him for 30 years until his death. He discovered an odd trend in the sales records while going over the plantation ledgers at a small estate in Middle Georgia known as Moss Creek. For 15 years, 23 male slaves were sold. They are all selling for significantly more than their market value. Every one of them has a note in the margin, certified in prime condition. The broker was unaware at the time that those two words held a secret so unsettling that the carefully crafted lies of Georgia's most powerful families would be threatened to be exposed when the truth came to light. Local officials suppressed testimony, destroyed records, and hid the evidence for decades. However, some secrets refuse to be hidden, particularly when they are meticulously documented and written in blood by a lady who recognized that the best weapon is not violence but truth. I have a question for you before we go on to the tale of Eleanor Creswell and the plantation that turned into a graveyard for both reputations and bodies. Tell us which state or city you're from if you're listening from Georgia or any other southern state. Click the subscribe button if this introduction has already made you shiver, because what you're about to hear will make you rethink all you believe to be true about the antebellum South. The Charleston broker's observations that spring afternoon were only the beginning of something much more profound. A well-planned process that had been operating efficiently since 1841. The 370 acres of Georgia clay soil that made up Moss Creek Plantation, not one of the great estates that typified Southern aristocracy, it was tucked away between the Oconee River and the county road that linked Milledgeville and Augusta. No expansive grounds, no home with white columns, and no reputation for extravagant parties. Moss Creek, on the other hand, was renowned for its effectiveness. 12 slave cabins, a cotton gin, a smokehouse, and a barn that the locals observed appeared to be functional rather than impressive, surrounded the main house, a modest two-story building made of local timber, disproportionately big for a plantation of its size. When her husband Thomas unexpectedly passed away in 1840 from what the doctor diagnosed as apoplexy, Eleanor Creswell inherited Moss Creek. According to official records, she was 31 years old, childless, and her neighbors expected her to sell the property and return to Savannah, where her family had a reputable shipping company. As an alternative, she fired the overseer her husband had hired, assumed management herself, and in less than a year, she had turned Moss Creek from a failing enterprise into one of the county's most lucrative mid-sized plantations. She used what she referred to as strategic acquisition and disposal to accomplish this. Others who owned slaves did so for centuries, creating communities of families who farmed the same land as their parents, and Eleanor handled her employees like a well-managed investment portfolio, just as her grandmother had done. She would buy young male slaves at the market, hold them for 12 to 18 months, and then sell them to plantations in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama for hefty profits, states where there was a constant need for labor due to the growing cotton frontier. At Moss Creek, the women stayed for good, never more than 6 or 7 at a time. They cleaned the house, the kitchen, and the vegetable garden. Their incapacity to procreate led to their selection. They were older and past childbearing age. Eleanor had no compassion for family problems and no interest in rearing slave children. Until it was much too late, her neighbors would not comprehend her desire for efficiency, profit, and something more. Eleanor had established herself as a savvy businesswoman by 1845. Reluctantly, male growers who had previously refused to engage in negotiations with a woman were impressed by her understanding of market prices, soil management, and cotton yields. She never went to church, socialized, or engaged in the customs that characterized Southern womanhood. When questioned about her unwomanly actions, she would respond with a tight, calculating smile that never extended to her eyes, claiming that being a widow had relieved her of the need to put on a front. What anyone could have predicted or known was that Eleanor maintained 3 different book sets. First, any neighbor or tax assessor might inspect the normal plantation records, expenses, yields, and sales. The second showed Moss Creek's actual profits, which were much higher than those shown in the official ledger. The third set of books, written in a cipher she had created herself, based on shipping manifests she had learned from her father's Savannah business, was stored in a locked iron box under the floorboards of her bedroom. Everything was written down by Eleanor in those coded pages: dates, names, physical details, and, above all, observations that would have been meaningless to the average reader, but crucial to those who knew what she was creating. She wrote down each name's eye color, Hair type, the set of jaws, the nose shape, and the skin tone in various lighting conditions. When the time came to level her charges, she would be able to use the genealogical record she was compiling as a catalog. At Moss Creek, the routine never changed. Eleanor would keep a new slave apart from the others for the first week after purchasing him. These slaves were always male, always between the ages of 18 and 25, and always robust and healthy. Though they never discussed it openly, not even among themselves, the other slaves understood what this meant. Even in whispers, some things were too risky to say. Eleanor would call the young man to the main house on the 7th night. The slaves who worked in the house saw certain things, but what transpired during those hours was kept behind shut doors. They saw that Eleanor usually took a bath before going out, that she wore a certain dress, one that was simple and made of gray cotton, and that she left a lamp on in her bedroom till after midnight. They observed that the young guys who came out the following morning moved differently, with their shoulders bent inside as though to reduce their size and their eyes downcast. The next day they saw that Eleanor would spend hours in her study, writing in her private ledger with the focus of a clear recording legal testimony, while the iron box next to her remained open. Although it would take years for anyone to link the initial disappearance to Moss Creek, it happened in the fall of 1843. Samuel, a slave who was sold for the astounding sum of $1,800 to an Alabama cotton planter, never made it to his destination. In a furious letter to Eleanor, the buyer demanded a refund or the slave. Eleanor replied with a courteous statement of concern, copies of the bill of sale, and a signed receipt from the driver who had driven Samuel. The case was dropped. Slaves fled. Everyone was aware that Samuel might have taken advantage of the opportunity to become free while traveling west. Eleanor sold another man 6 months later. Isaac, who was bought by a planter in Mississippi, also disappeared between Georgia and his final destination. Once more, Eleanor's documentation was flawless. Once more, the buyer reluctantly conceded the loss. Although it looked implausible, it was not impossible for 2 slaves from the same tiny plantation to successfully escape. 5 guys that Moss Creek had sold had vanished into thin air by 1847. Alarms should have been raised by the pattern, but they weren't. The purchasers were dispersed over 3 states. Planters rarely communicated with one another. And Eleanor's reputation for integrity persisted. Pure. She consistently offered supporting evidence, showed the proper amount of concern, and implied that the men had probably run away as soon as possible. Her reasoning was not only plausible, but also expected in a system that was based on the idea that enslaved people were always looking for liberation. None of those men had ever left Georgia, but nobody knew that. On Moss Creek Farm, their remains were interred in unmarked graves in a part of the property where the soil was rough and unsuitable for cotton. Eleanor had instructed her field workers not to plow there because she planned to grow an orchard there in the future. The land remained unaltered, slowly filling with the dead, but the orchard never came. Like everything Eleanor did, there was a pattern to the killings. She would record her findings in the coded notebook, complete her ritual with each young man, and then wait. Throughout the man's remaining months at Moss Creek, she would take good care of him, making sure he put on muscle and weight, which would increase his market value. She would arrange for him to be evaluated by a physician who would attest to his excellent physical health. Through middlemen who took care of the shipping, she would always set up the sale to a buyer at least 300 meters away. She would then call him to the barn after midnight 3 days prior to the planned departure. Neighbors, Eleanor's barn, which housed not only hay and equipment but also a tiny room at the back that could only be accessed by a locked door. She would give him a drink in that room. A rare treat before the long journey ahead, she continued, referring to whiskey. There was just enough laudanum in the whiskey to make him sleepy, but not so much that he passed out. She needed him to know what was going to happen next. She needed him to get it. The ledger would be shown to him by Eleanor. She would describe exactly what she had recorded in cool, collected tones. The physical traits she had seen, the ones that matched guys he had never met and whose names had no meaning for him, would be shared with him. She would then go on to describe her plans for using that information, including how she would use it to destroy families, expose hypocrisy, and topple the foundation of Southern society. She would watch his expression as understanding set in, when he realized that he had been picked not because he was young or strong, but rather because he had specific qualities that Eleanor had been looking for. qualities that made him important for evidence rather than work. She would then call for the only person at Moss Creek who was aware of the entire scope of her intentions, the only person she trusted with her secrets, and the only person who shared her distaste for the system that had produced places like Moss Creek, as the laudanum dragged him further into a state of stupor. Together they would finish the work they had started years earlier when her son came out of the barn's shadows. It was not intended for Henry Creswell to exist. Every census record, church registry, and public record indicates that Eleanor and Thomas Creswell were barren during their 12-year marriage. It was accurate. The paperwork failed to disclose that Eleanor had given birth to a son in 1829, 7 years before to her marriage, at the age of 20 and single. This scandal would have ruined her family's standing in Savannah's close-knit merchant community. The father was a man who her own father could never have recognized or approved of. Before turning 1 year old, the child was transported north, deposited in Philadelphia with Eleanor's maternal aunt, a widow who consented to raise the kid as her adoptive son. Every year in the winter, when traveling from Georgia to Pennsylvania could be justified as a family duty, Eleanor paid a visit. Growing up, Henry was aware of his mother's identity, but he also understood that he could never publicly claim her and should only refer to her as Aunt Elena in case someone heard. He was also aware of his father's past as a child. A guy who loaded ships for Elena's father was a slave on a Savannah port. During a summer when Elena was disobedient and her parents were preoccupied with other things, Elena had fallen in love with him because of his quiet dignity and knowledge. Business-related issues. When it became impossible to conceal her pregnancy, a man was sold to a Louisiana sugar plantation where field workers' lifespans were measured in years rather than decades. He was never seen by Eleanor again. Years later, after thorough investigation, she discovered that he had passed away in 1835. His body was thrown in an unmarked grave like refuse after being worked to death in cane fields. Something inside her had solidified as a result of that awareness, changed her fury and grief into something more menacing and frigid, a scheme that would burn down everything the men who had destroyed her had destroyed, but it would take decades to carry out. Life is revered. In 1841, 1 year after Thomas Creswell's passing, Henry made his way back to Georgia. He arrived not as Elena's son, but as Henry Lell, a traveling trader dealing in farm equipment, a reputable businessman from Philadelphia with authentic credentials and a good reputation. He frequently traveled through Middle Georgia on business, stayed at boarding houses in Milledgeville and Augusta, and occasionally traveled to Moss Creek to talk with the shrewd widow Creswell about buying equipment. Nobody had any idea that Henry had his own room in the main house, that those trips occasionally lasted for days, or that he and Eleanor spent long evenings going over the coded ledger and making plans for the future. Nobody realized that the exceptionally spacious barn had a secret cellar in addition to a lockable room, accessible under the hay via a trapdoor, a cellar where certain tools were stored, and where specific jobs requiring complete seclusion were finished. The selecting procedure was rigorous. The victims weren't picked at random by Elena. She had done extensive study on each man she bought. She would go to marketplaces in Milledgeville, Augusta, and Savannah, evaluating young male slaves with the meticulousness of a bloodline-studying horse breeder. However, she wasn't examining muscular tone or teeth. She was examining faces. She had devoted years to gathering data about Georgia's most well-known families, researching their genealogy, learning about their history, and above all, discovering their secrets. She was aware of which families had carefully hidden branches of mixed races, which males kept separate second homes with slave mistresses, and which landowners had fathered children with enslaved women. She knew these things because slaves who worked in large mansions chatted among themselves, because affluent men were rarely discreet about their misdeeds, and because knowledge flowed through networks that white society never thought existed. Elena would buy a young slave at any price if his characteristics matched those of a well-known family. The characteristic routage nose, the Peton jaw, the peculiar gray-green eyes that distinguished the Caldwell line. She'd take him to Moss Creek, finish her rite, and document all the information that could establish paternity. Everything that could persuade a jury, should it ever come to that, including skin tone in various lighting conditions, eye color, hair texture, ear shape, freckle or birthmark patterns, and more. However, Eleanor had no interest in court cases. She knew enough about Southern justice to know that no court would support her in her efforts to expose the families. The law wasn't her weapon. It was dishonorable. She was gathering proof that would make proud families face realities they had been avoiding for centuries. Evidence that would expose the fundamental hypocrisy of a system that used race to define humanity, while those in charge of enforcing that system frequently stepped over what they claimed to be sacred boundaries. The individuals she selected turned into living examples of that duplicity. The truth can be pushed out of her grasp since living evidence might be contested, denied, or distorted. They turned into indestructible proof, bodies that, if required, could be expelled, bones that were measurable, evidence that was incapable of lying, running away, or refusing to testify. 13 men were buried in the uncultivated area of Moss Creek by 1850. Elena's coded ledger has 13 sets of measurements. 13 households were designated to be destroyed whenever Eleanor felt it was appropriate to share her knowledge. However, something was changing. The nation was evolving. Tensions between North and South were escalating. Conflicts over the spread of slavery had been momentarily resolved by the 1850 Compromise. However, everyone was aware that the calm was ephemeral, and that more significant conflicts were imminent. Eleanor started to question whether her meticulously planned strategy would ever come to pass. If the increasingly certain war were to destroy not only the South, but also her capacity to have her allegations taken seriously. Next, in an opportunity that would alter everything and force Elena to speed up her timeline and take unintended risks, came up in the summer of 1856. Moss Creek received a letter from Boston. A man named Daniel Harrington signed it, identifying himself as a lawyer and correspondent for the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator, and addressed it to Widow Creswell. He had heard about certain abnormalities at her plantation from sources he would not name. He had concerns about the way she conducted business, the unusual turnover in her staff, and the guys who had vanished after being sold. In September, he planned to visit Georgia and intended to speak with her about these issues. With unwavering composure and a blank expression, Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Then she showed the message to Henry, who was in town that week, and called for him. "Someone has been talking," she uttered in a whisper. "Someone is overly knowledgeable." Henry read the letter carefully. According to Elena's worried recollections, his face looked a lot like his father's. He said, "Do we stop?" "Stay silent until he stops being interested." Elena grinned, but it was a tight smile that never extended to her eyes. "No," she replied. "We invite him to come and show him exactly what he hopes to see. A prosperous plantation run by a capable widow. After that, we find out who sent him and what they truly know." Eleanor was unaware that Daniel Harrington's letter wasn't the start of her troubles. Rather, it was a warning sign of something much more serious, a series of events that would bring all of her secrets to light much sooner than she ever imagined. If you're still reading this and have been captivated by its dark revelations, please take a moment to click the like button and share your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you think Elena's plan was justice or madness? Was she fighting a corrupt system or turning into the same monstrous entity as the institution she detested? If so, please subscribe because this story is about to take unexpected turns. Let's see what happened when the Boston lawyer arrived at Moss Creek. On September 15, 1856, Daniel Harrington arrived at Moss Creek in a modest carriage he had hired in Milledgeville. He was 42 years old, thin and angular, with the pale complexion of a man who spent most of his time indoors reviewing legal documents. He wore a dark suit that immediately identified him as a Northerner. The cut was incorrect, the fabric too heavy for Georgia heat. The letter had come through channels that should have been secure. Someone in Eleanor's network, the network of information that flowed between slaves, between households, and between plantations, had betrayed her. A working lawyer at the time, not one of the wealthy abolitionists who funded the movement from comfortable Boston parlors. He stepped out of the carriage and took off his hat to wipe his forehead. Eleanor saw that his hands were ink-stained and his collar was slightly frayed. Elena welcomed him in the front parlor, a room she kept immaculate but purposefully modest. No pricey furniture, no elaborate decorations, nothing that would suggest Moss Creek was more profitable than her official accounts showed. And she listened patiently as he explained his goal. "Mrs. Creswell," he started, his Boston accent marking every word. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "You have been misinformed, Mr. Harrington. I maintain a small workforce of women who do domestic duties. The men I purchase are kept for 12 to 18 months, during which time I invest in their health and training, then sold at profit to planters in expanding territories. I have received correspondence from people who say that your plantation operates under unusual circumstances, specifically that you maintain an all-male workforce, that these men are sold after short periods of time, and that several have vanished during transport. As for disappearances, I can only assume you're referring to men who chose to escape rather than be transported to New Harrington, took a notebook out of his coat pocket and said, I have 5 documented cases of men sold by you who never reached their destinations, 5 men who vanished without trace in a period of 12 years. That seems statistically significant. Elena responded coolly, as if a Boston lawyer were seeing patterns that don't exist because he wants them to exist. I provide all buyers with proper documentation and certified health assessments. If slaves choose to escape, that reflects their desperation, not my practices. Mr. Harrington, you're looking for proof of cruelty. Something dramatic to tell your abolitionist friends, but you won't find it. Moss Creek is a business run legally and efficiently, nothing more. Then you won't mind if I stay here for a few days. Ask some of your neighbors, maybe even talk to the slaves who work here. Eleanor's face remained the same. You can waste your time however you like. My neighbors will tell you that I'm a capable businesswoman who has turned around a failing plantation. Elena stood smoothing her skirt. Then I won't stop you. I should warn you that your presence here, asking questions, spreading northern ideas won't be appreciated. Georgia isn't Boston, Mr. Harrington. People here protect their own and they don't take kindly to outside interference. As for interviewing my slaves, you know as well as I do that their testimony would be worthless in any legal proceeding. They'll tell you whatever they think you want to hear. Nevertheless, I'd like to try. Statement of fact. But Harrington heard the warning underneath, and by the time he left Moss Creek that afternoon, he was already unsure about his investigation. Eleanor had been too composed and organized, and she had provided documentation for every claim and answered all of the questions with ease. She had been exactly what she had claimed to be, a capable businesswoman running a lawful plantation. However, Harrington had not survived as an abolitionist lawyer by taking on appearances. He took a room at a boarding house in Milledgeville, and for the next 3 days he collected information in a discreet manner, speaking with merchants who had done business with Moss Creek, other planters who knew Eleanor, and the doctor who had certified the health of her slaves before sale. Everyone related the same story about Elena Creswell, a unique woman who ran a plantation by herself, but was scrupulously honest in her dealings. On his 4th day in Milledgeville, Harrington was surprised by an elderly black woman who came to his boarding house after dark and asked to speak with him privately. She claimed to be Ruth, a house slave at Moss Creek, and that she had worked there since Eleanor's husband was still alive. She had knowledge about the plantation, about events that took place there, and about things that no one outside of Moss Creek knew. Ruth invited her into his room, offered her the only chair, and listened as Ruth spoke in hushed, urgent tones, telling him about the young men Elena bought, about the 7th night ritual, about the unusual amount of time Elena spent in her study recording information in ledgers that no one else was allowed to see, about the barn, about the locked room at the back, and how she had occasionally heard sounds coming from that direction late at night, sounds that scared her, though she didn't know why. She ain't right, Ruth said, her weathered hands twisted together in her lap. Something was wrong with Mrs. Eleanor. Been wrong since Mr. Thomas died. Perhaps she had a coldness, a planning coldness, before she died. As for the young men she buys, some of them simply disappear one night and we never see them again. Do you know what happens to them? No one says it aloud, but there's a section of the property where she doesn't let anybody work. So one day she's going to plant an orchard there, Harrington said, bending forward. Ruth shook her head. I've seen her and that man. She stopped abruptly as if she'd said too much. What man? Harrington pressed. The equipment man. He calls himself Mr. Lell. He comes by frequently and stays for days at a time. She claims that he is selling her agricultural equipment, but I haven't seen a lot of new equipment come in. I have witnessed the two of them discussing plans, looking at her books, and talking late into the night. Ruth looked anxiously at the door as she got up to go. I should have stayed away. I'm not sure what she'll do if she discovers out I spoke with you, but someone has to know. Mr. Harrington, something sinister is going on in Moss Creek. Something that must end. Ruth departed, and Harrington took a seat in the shadows of his chamber, attempting to interpret what he had heard. Elena was more than just the owner of a peculiar plantation, if Ruth was being honest. Something illegal was being concealed by her. What exactly was the question? Moreover, how could he demonstrate it? Harrington rented a horse and returned to Moss Creek the following morning. In an effort to surprise Elena, he hadn't announced his coming. Yet utterly unaffected by his presence, he found her in the front yard overseeing the loading of cotton bales onto a cart. "Mr. Harrington," she acknowledged, using her apron to wipe her hands. Eleanor's smile tightened slightly, but her voice remained pleasant. "Back so soon? I thought you'd have finished your investigation by now. I'd like to see your property," he said, referring to the entire property, including the outbuildings. "Of course, though, I'm not sure what you expect to find. Moss Creek isn't particularly interesting." Eleanor gave him a tour. When they arrived at the barn, Elena opened the main doors wide, revealing to him the area where equipment was kept, where hay was kept for the mule and horses, and the back room, and the cotton gin, the smokehouse, the slave cabins. Everything was exactly as one would expect on a small plantation. Functional, well-maintained, unremarkable. "There's a door in the back," Harrington inquired. "I apologize," Eleanor remarked. "I haven't had time." "Nothing noteworthy. I want to see it." Eleanor looked at him for a long time, and Harrington noticed a flicker of calculation rather than fear in her eyes as she considered her options and made a decision. "Very well," she said at last, pulling a key from her pocket and opening the door. The room was just as she had described it. It was filled with broken plow blades, old tools, coils of rope, and empty barrels. The dust was thick on everything, and cobwebs were spread across the corners. Eleanor asked from the doorway, satisfied, and Harrington turned to face her, uncertain and frustrated. Everything Ruth had told him seemed plausible, but he had no proof. Nothing tangible he could take to authorities or publish in the Liberator. Harrington walked through the room slowly, looking at everything, searching for something that might confirm Ruth's suspicions. But there was nothing there. No signs of recent activity, no evidence of violence. Nothing that suggested this room was anything other than forgotten storage. For the time being, accusations regarding Southern planters, he stated. However, Harrington spotted something strange as they made their way back to the main home. There were little elevations and depressions in the ground next to the barn, indicating that it had been disturbed at some time. He recalled what Ruth had said about filling and digging. He looked in the direction she had indicated, the spot where Elena said she would plant an orchard in the future. It appeared to be typical uncultivated ground from a distance, rocky and unsuited for cotton. However, something about the vegetation's growth there was distinctive, patterns that weren't exactly consistent with the surroundings. He pointed to that section there. "Why didn't you create it?" "Poor soil," Elena said right away. "I haven't had time to adequately prepare it for an orchard, and it's too rocky for cotton. It's something I want to work on in the future." In an attempt to ascertain whether his suspicions were correct or whether he was observing patterns that did not exist, Harrington examined the terrain. More unsure than ever of what was going on at Moss Creek, he rode back to Milledgeville after thanking Elena for her time. He couldn't have known and didn't know that the room he had just looked in was what Elena wanted him to see. Exactly. A well-planned front. Below it was the actual room where the work was done. Beneath those empty barrels, hidden beneath a layer of straw and mud, the trapdoor was invisible unless you knew just where to look. In addition, 13 meticulously labeled wooden boxes with comprehensive data of each individual buried in that rocky field were securely kept in the dungeon below, together with the tools Ruth had heard being used late at night. In an effort to find proof to back up Ruth's allegations, Daniel Harrington spent an additional week in Georgia, interviewing anyone who would speak with him. But the tale was the same everywhere he looked. There was something peculiar about Elena Creswell. Yes, but there was no evidence of misconduct. The sales were accurately recorded. At least for the slaves who did show up, the buyers attested to getting what they paid for. Although suspicious, escape efforts could account for the disappearances. Ruth's testimony would be useless in any court case because it came from an enslaved woman who had no tangible proof to back up her allegations. In early October, a frustrated Harrington made his way back to Boston. He described Moss Creek and his concerns in a brief piece for the Liberator. But even his abolitionist colleagues were hesitant to look into the topic further in the absence of hard proof. The piece received little attention since it was buried among other stories of Southern injustice on page 7. The story was forgotten within a month. Elena, however, remembered. A dangerous weakness in her system had been revealed by Harrington's visit. Ruth had clearly spoken to someone. That implied that other people might also speak. It implied that her secrets were more exposed than she had thought. In order to avoid another investigator asking questions, she had to expedite her plans to go from documentation to action. Eleanor called Ruth to the main house the evening following her confirmation that Harrington had left Georgia. The elderly woman came shakily, knowing in some way that her treachery had been exposed. Eleanor poured her a glass of water, sat her down in the parlor, and spoke in soft, almost soothing tones. "You spoke with the attorney," Eleanor remarked. Ruth's hands were shaking so much that she was unable to grasp the glass. It wasn't a question. "Mrs. Ruth, I understand why you did it. You're scared and I won't penalize you." Eleanor leaned forward. "But I need you to understand something. What's happening at Moss Creek? It's not what you think. I'm not a monster. I'm not killing those men out of cruelty or madness. I'm building something. A weapon that will destroy the very system that enslaved you, that enslaved your parents, and that, if someone doesn't stop it, will enslave your grandchildren. You've seen things you don't understand, and you wanted someone to stop it." Ruth looked at her, bewildered and afraid. "I don't understand." Mrs. Elena got up and took the iron box from her study, opened it, and showed Ruth the coded ledgers. "I've spent 16 years documenting the proof that every man I've brought to Moss Creek was picked for a reason, and each one of them carries blood that links them to Georgia's most powerful families." She produced sketches she had made, detailed drawings that showed facial features, measurements, and comparisons. "Look at this man. His name was Isaac. Look at his eyes, Ruth. Do you know who else has eyes that exact shade of gray-green? Senator Caldwell. I've seen the senator's portrait. I've studied his family. Isaac was his grandson." "Ruth," she said, "I'm creating an archive that will force this state, this entire region, to confront truths they've spent generations denying." Ruth's eyes widened in understanding and horror. "And you killed them." "I preserved the evidence," Elena corrected coldly. "Living men can be moved, can be sold again, can disappear into the vast expanse of this country where I could never find them again. Dead men stay where I put them. Isaac is not the only one. There are 12 more, all carrying blood that connects them to families who claim their lineage is pure, who build their entire identity on the lie of racial superiority. Dead men cannot refute what their corpses indicate, but Mrs. Ruth murmured, "That's murder. Their bones can be measured, inspected, and compared. That is wicked. What is evil is a society that permits wealthy men to rape women they own, to father children they will never acknowledge, and to establish empires on the bodies of people they have declared less valuable." Elena's face hardened. "What is evil is the system that made it necessary for men like Isaac to exist. More than human. I'm not the monster here, Ruth. I'm the reckoning." Ruth sat stunned, unable to comprehend what she was hearing until she finally asked the question that had been bothering her ever since Elena started this explanation. "What about Mr. Lal? Who is he really?" Elena grinned, and for the first time her face showed what appeared to be real emotion. "He's my son. My own child lives in a world that would destroy him if they knew the truth about his father. It is a world that needs to burn. That's why I understand this fight, Ruth. That's why I'll never stop." In that moment, Ruth realized that Eleanor was much more dangerous than she had thought. This wasn't madness. This was something worse. A planned multi-dead campaign of retaliation that had already claimed 13 lives and showed no sign. Ruth said softly, "What are you going to do with all of this?" "When soon?" Eleanor replied. "Everyone can sense that the country is heading toward war. And when that war comes, when the South is weak and vulnerable, I'll release everything, every name, every connection, every piece of evidence," Ruth said. "I'll mail copies to newspapers in the North and South, to government officials, to churches, and to make sure the entire nation knows what hypocrites. I'll do it in a way that can't be disregarded or suppressed, because the evidence will be irrefutable. I built this system. What lies sustain it," she said, closing the iron box and locking it once more. Ruth nodded slowly, but she felt as though she were drowning. She understood, but understanding didn't make it right. 13 men were dead. "But I need your silence, Ruth. I need you to understand that if you talk again, if you bring anyone else here asking questions, you won't just be endangering me, you'll be destroying the only chance we have to make these people pay for what they've done." There had to be another way. Ruth reasoned, a path that did not involve murder. But she also knew that in 1856 Georgia, no court would accept slave testimony against white families. No newspaper would publish accusations from an enslaved woman, and there was no legal mechanism that would allow the truth Elena had documented to be heard in a system built on injustice. Elena had concluded that only injustice could bring it down. 13 men, regardless of whose blood they carried, had been murdered to serve Elena's vision of justice. The knowledge of what Moss Creek was and the terrible realization that she was now complicit in whatever happened next were the burdens Ruth carried with her when she left the main house that night. Elena proceeded with renewed urgency over the next few months, buying 3 more young men between October 1856 and March 1857, each one chosen with even more care than the last. She was no longer building her archive slowly over years, but rather racing against time, trying to finish her collection before war came, or before another investigator with more resources than Daniel Harrington arrived. Henry visited Moss more frequently, Creek occasionally staying for weeks at a time. He told his friends that he had closed his business in Philadelphia and was thinking of moving to the South because there seemed to be more opportunities there. No one questioned this. Many Northerners were moving south during those years, lured by the promise of cotton wealth and cheap land. But in reality, mother and son were getting ready for the endgame. Henry had started copying Elena's coded ledgers, translating them into plain English, and putting them in various places: a bank vault in Savannah, a lawyer's office in Charleston, and a trusted contact in Pennsylvania. They were creating redundancy, making sure that even if Eleanor or her original documents were destroyed, the evidence would still be there. They also improved their method, and now the cellar beneath the barn held detailed anatomical records in addition to bodies. Henry had studied medicine for 2 years before he left it for business, and he applied that knowledge to their work. After each killing, he would take measurements, make sketches, preserve hair samples, and in some cases, remove specific bones that showed distinctive family traits. It was grisly work, but Henry approached it with clinical detachment. These weren't people to him. They were evidence in a case that would change the course of history. By the spring of 1857, Elena's archive revealed ties to 17 powerful Georgia families, 17 senators, judges, plantation owners, and merchants whose meticulously tended family trees, hidden branches they would never recognize. 17 men whose social standing and political power were based on the delusion that their bloodlines were pure. Eleanor estimated she would need proof-linking at least 25 families before she would have enough clout to create the cascade effect she desired, where the scandal would spread like fire through the interconnected web of Georgia's elite. She was close. Maybe one more year of work, one more handful if she would have everything she needed if she had carefully chosen men. But fate had other ideas. In April 1857, a Charleston cotton broker named William Thorne came to Moss Creek to review her ledgers, and it was in those ledgers that he saw the pattern that would start Eleanor's downfall. Thorne was meticulous in a way that Eleanor hadn't expected. Most buyers looked at plantation accounts focusing only on profit margins, production costs, sale prices, and bottom-line figures. Thorne was intrigued rather than suspicious, and he assumed there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Eleanor had connections with particular buyers who valued her slaves highly. Maybe she provided some training or preparation that justified the premium prices. He noted that every male slave Eleanor sold brought prices much higher than the market average. He saw that the notation, "prime condition certified," appeared with suspicious consistency. And most damningly, he saw that several of the men listed as sold never appeared in subsequent records from their supposed buyers. Thorne left Moss Creek that afternoon with the intention of making discreet inquiries. If something odd was happening, if Elena was somehow manipulating her records or engaging in fraud, he had a professional obligation to investigate. More importantly, he had relationships with several of the planters listed as buyers in her ledgers, so he could confirm whether or not Elena was engaging in fraud. He casually expected Eleanor to explain the pattern, but instead he saw something flash across her face for a fraction of a second, causing his professional instincts to prickle with alarm. "He's going to check," she said, pacing the study. "He's going to contact the buyers and discover the men never arrived. And then he's going to come back with authorities, or he's going to spread word, and everything will unravel before we're ready. Elena watched his carriage disappear down the road and immediately sent word to Henry in Milligville. They met that night in the main house, and for the first time in 16 years, Eleanor felt genuine panic. It won't be perfect, but it will be enough. It won't, Eleanor insisted. 17 families isn't enough to create the cascade we need. They'll suppress it. We stop now, he said softly. We take what we have. 17 families, enough to cause significant damage, and we release it. Mail the copies tomorrow. Send them everywhere we planned. We need more. We need enough connections that they can't possibly contain the scandal. Then what do you propose? Elena stopped pacing. Her hands, which had been shaking moments earlier, steadied themselves. Her voice carried the cold certainty that had guided her through 16 years of patient work. We eliminate the problem. Thorn has noticed, but he hasn't told anyone. They'll find ways to discredit the evidence to claim the documents are forgeries to murder anyone who tries to investigate. Henry turned from the window, his face troubled. You're talking about killing a white man, a respectable businessman from Charleston. That's completely different from what we've been doing. The slaves. No one looks into the disappearance of slaves, but this time, they'll hunt down the person who did it. He's going to make inquiries first, confirm his suspicions before making accusations. That gives us a window. A few days, perhaps a week. The next 2 days, Elena and Henry worked out their plan, learning that Thorn was staying at the Milligville Hotel, that he was going to spend the week visiting plantations in the area and meeting with potential clients, that they would hunt a runaway slave, that they would hunt someone who attacked Thorn during a robbery, and that they would hunt whoever we tell them to hunt, but they won't suspect me. Wealthy white men don't suspect respectable widows of murder. Every night after supper, he went for the usual constitutional walk along the peaceful road that ended at the river. Generally indifferent to danger, he walked alone with a small pistol for protection. He felt that Milligville was civilized, unlike the more rugged areas where one had to be afraid of violence. As the sun sank on April 23rd and Thorn started his nightly stroll, a stranger came up behind him. The figure was dressed in the rough work clothing of a field hand, which were taken from Elena's farm. A cap pulled low partially covered his face. As if he had nothing left to lose, he moved with a desperate urgency. The following events would be described as a sad robbery in the Milligville newspaper. Witnesses described a huge manslave, presumably an escapee from a nearby plantation, attacking William Thorn, a well-known broker from Charleston, on the river path. The single shot from Thorn's weapon went wildly. He was repeatedly hit by a blunt object which was later identified as a piece of wood, possibly a tree branch. He had 3 fractures in his head. In a matter of minutes, he passed away. His pocket watch and cash were gone, most likely seized by his assailant. However, oddly enough, his leather satchel was abandoned at the scene with its contents unaltered, containing business documents. Some people found this detail strange. Why would a thief disregard valuable documents and simply take money? However, the question was forgotten in the hysteria that followed the murder. A large-scale manhunt was planned. We looked for missing slaves on every plantation within 20 meters. For days, patrols searched the countryside, certain that the murderer must still be there. They couldn't find anything. There were no slaves reported missing. There were no witnesses. Forward with helpful details. After a while, the probe came to nothing. In an area where violence was so prevalent that people eventually stopped asking questions, there was yet another unresolved tragedy. What? The fact that the man who killed William Thorn had not even run away was something that nobody knew or even suspected. He'd gone back to Moss Creek, taken the pilfered garments out of the cellar under the barn, cleaned up the blood, and gone back to being Henry Lell, the good Philadelphia merchant. When the manhunt started, he was sitting in Elena's parlor, calmly talking to a neighbor who had come to visit the widow and pay his condolences about cotton prices. The killing purchased Eleanor time, but it also made a significant shift to the way they operate. Eleanor had believed that killing the slaves was a necessary evil that served a higher purpose. They were sacrifices that would eventually release thousands of people, and they were victims in a struggle against an unfair system. Thorn, however, was unique. Thorn was not guilty of the initial offenses committed by the system. He was merely a man who had inquired after noticing anything strange. Justice was not served by his death. To keep their secret, it was merely murder. So did Henry. Thorne grew quieter and more reclusive in the weeks after his passing. Even while he continued to assist Elena with her work and take part in their plans, he had changed. There were holes in the unshakable assurance that had held them up for 16 years. We find out that Elena and Henry have crossed a line that alters everything, just when we thought the horror at Moss Creek couldn't possibly be any darker. Their goal of bringing hypocrisy to light has turned into the exact kind of evil they say they oppose. Share this video with someone who enjoys dark historical mysteries if this narrative is chilling you, and you're wondering if justice can ever be served by such horrible means. If you want to encourage material that delves into the complex facts concealed in our past, hit the like button. Additionally, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the unexpected ending, because what follows will compel you to reevaluate all of your assumptions regarding Eleanor's scheme. The actual repercussions of Thorne's murder were illegal. No one ever suspected Eleanor or Henry. The actual effect was that it made Eleanor face a difficult reality. Because of her fight against injustice, she was able to commit any atrocity if she felt it would further her goals. She had became everything she detested. Someone who is prepared to ruin people's lives in order to defend a system. She had spent 16 years creating her strategy of retaliation. The truth about what actually transpired at Moss Creek was revealed by a historical accident rather than by inquiry or exposé. Georgia was rocked by the Civil War when it eventually broke out in 1861. Plantations were taken, destroyed by fire, or abandoned. Documents were destroyed. In just 4 years, the social structure that had supported communities like Moss Creek for many generations came to an end. Elena Creswell passed away in 1863. She was not slain by exposure or justice, but by pneumonia. According to her neighbors, she passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 54. Her archive was never made public. Instead, everything was consumed by the war that she had anticipated would pave the way for her disclosure. Her meticulously recorded proof was still coded and stored in the iron box under her floorboards. Henry vanished at some point in 1864. He was just out of Milledgeville one day. Others claimed he had been slain in one of the sporadic acts of violence that marked the last years of the war, while others claimed he had gone back north. His true fate is still unknown. He had kept copies of Eleanor's ledgers in different places, but they were lost in the confusion. Savannah's bank caught fire. The Charleston lawyer passed away. During the war years, the contacts in Pennsylvania either relocated or died. In 1865, Moss Creek itself was abandoned. The property returned to the state since Elena was deceased and there was no clear heir. Over the ensuing decades, a variety of people lived there, but none remained for very long. The house started to deteriorate. The fields went back into a wilderness. In 1871, a storm caused the barn, that atypically enormous barn, to collapse. For 37 years, the remains in the rocky area where Eleanor intended to establish an orchard were undiscovered. A developer bought the Moss Creek land in 1902 with the intention of constructing a school. The first skeleton was discovered during excavation, followed by another and eventually a few more. They eventually discovered 16 bodies interred in shallow graves with wooden boxes that had measurements, sketches, and hair samples. In Georgia, the finding caused a stir. Newspapers published speculative articles about what had occurred. The identities of the victims and the reasons behind had been laid to rest there. However, since slavery had been abolished, Elena had been deceased for almost 40 years, and the most of the notable families from her time were either extinct or diminished. There was no one to bring charges against or a coherent story to explain the atrocity that had been discovered. When the main house was being demolished, the iron box was discovered. After finding it under rotting floorboards, a construction worker opened the lock out of curiosity about what was within. He discovered ledgers in an unintelligible code, face sketches, precise measurements, and notes that appeared to be related to genealogical or breeding research. He gave the box to local officials who had a quick look at it before putting it in a courthouse basement. Eleanor's cipher was unintelligible, and the documents were eventually forgotten once more. The iron box wasn't discovered in courtroom archives until 1957, precisely 100 years after William Thorne's murder, by a graduate student doing research for his dissertation in Antebellum, Georgia. The student worked for 2 years to crack Eleanor's cipher because he was fascinated by the coded ledgers. His dissertation committee first rejected his findings as legitimate, because of how unsettling what he found was when he eventually succeeded. However, the proof was there, thorough and incriminating. Eleanor has recorded 17 relationships between well-known white families and enslaved men. Dates, physical attributes, family histories, and, most horrifying of all, those males who had been preserved for evidence, her euphemism for murder, were all noted by her. The student's 1959 dissertation garnered little public attention, despite causing a small scandal in academic circles. Most of the families Eleanor had targeted were either no longer politically significant or had gone extinct. Her ledgers had no names for the particular people she had killed. They were only recognized by coded classifications, and there were no living victims to grieve for. Elena had hoped that the news would spark uproar, but it did not. What her decades' worth of records did demonstrate of meticulous documentation proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the very men who most vehemently defended the racial boundaries that Southern society had declared to be sacred and untouchable actually frequently crossed them. It was the hypocrisy Eleanor had spent her life uncovering. Charges were accurate was not the question that plagued researchers for decades afterward. Obviously they were. Whether her methods could ever be justified was the question. She had killed at least 16 individuals, if not more. She had calculated every action with icy precision, lied and manipulated. While committing terrible injustices of her own, she had professed to fight injustice. According to some academics, Elena was a product of her era, and the system she opposed was so blatantly wicked that drastic measures were the only choice. Others said that Elena's mission had made her become the very monster she claimed to be fighting against, and that murder could never be justified regardless of motivation. Conflicting accounts were given by the slaves who survived Moss Creek. Some people recalled Eleanor as being effective despite her cruelty, compared to other plantation owners. Others, such as Ruth, who lived until 1889, described the dread that dominated the area and the feeling that something sinister and evil was constantly hiding beneath the surface of daily life. Elena had informed Ruth that night in 1856, but Ruth never told anyone. Perhaps realizing that some secrets were too dangerous to share even in freedom, she carried that knowledge with her to the afterlife. Eleanor's near failure is the most disturbing part of the Moss Creek narrative. She might have released her archive in a way that could have caused the destruction she envisioned if the Civil War hadn't interrupted everything, if she had lived an additional 5 years, and if Thorne hadn't noticed the pattern in her ledgers. She could have made George's elite face the lies that kept them in power. It's possible that she would have transformed Southern society by using truth as a weapon. However, justice doesn't always come when we call for it, and history doesn't reward patience. After 16 years of planning, Elena's complex scheme ultimately achieved nothing more than increasing the number of casualties in an already violent period. For evidence no one would see for a century, the men she killed perished. For reasons unrelated to her disclosures, the families she aimed to ruin fell apart. War and political change brought an end to the system she detested, not the revelation of its duplicity. Nothing is left today of Moss Creek. The plantation's former location is now a commercial mall. There is a parking lot in the rocky field where the remains were interred. The location was formerly a property called Moss Creek, run by Eleanor Creswell, according to a modest historical sign, although it says nothing about what transpired there. Visitors drive by it without pausing, not realizing that beneath the paved surface lay the tombs of men whose names have been forgotten and whose deaths fulfilled an unfulfilled purpose. The Georgia Historical Society archives in Savannah are home to the Iron Box and its belongings. Although few do, researchers can request access with the right credentials. The fully translated and digitalized coded ledgers are now accessible to anyone interested enough to look through the archives. However, Elena's years of painstaking work and her thorough documentation are now simply another little-known historical footnote that the general public is unaware of, but finds fascinating. That might be the most blatant irony of all. In order to make the world face facts it would rather ignore, Elena wanted her evidence to be unavoidable. Instead, in a history already full of forgotten chapters, her story was reduced to yet another. Anyone now has access to the truth she died defending, but hardly anyone is interested in looking. The final query. The most concerning issue is raised by Eleanor's account. When evidence of historical wrongdoing comes too late to be significant, what should we do with it? Eleanor demonstrated the hypocrisy of Georgia's elite the fictitious nature of the racial divisions they upheld, and the fact that the foundation of the slave system was a falsehood even more basic than anybody realized. However, she demonstrated that it may have made a difference a century later. The folks she implicated were dead by the time her archive was deciphered. Their families grew smaller. Their world was already devastated by forces unrelated to her well-thought-out case. Does the truth matter if it comes to is it too late for justice? If no one can be held responsible, does it matter if evil is documented? We are forced to consider these issues by Moss Creek, and there are no easy answers to them. How do you feel about Elenena's tale? Was she a woman using the few tools at her disposal to fight injustice? Or had she turned into a monster like the system she detested? Could the larger cause she professed to serve ever justify her murders? Or does her plan's eventual failure demonstrate that using violence to further justice always taints the cause? Assertions to progress? Please share your ideas by leaving a comment below. If this story disturbed and thought-provoking you as much as it did me, please hit the notification bell and subscribe to this channel. We delve into the most sinister facets of American history, the stories that give us the creeps, the facts that contradict our historical presumptions. And if you'd like to talk about this tale further, distribute it to friends who value difficult ethical dilemmas and historical riddles. I appreciate you listening. I'll see you in the upcoming video.